What is up, guys? Welcome back to the YouTube channel. What we're going to be doing today is doing a full motor assembly from completely torn down block, bare block right here with the crank out, with everything out, to a full, complete, ready to run 4B11T for my Evo 10. This is going to be like a 600 or 700, well, I'm going to say a 700 horsepower capable motor. So everything that we are installing in this motor, aftermarket wise, I will link down below. So we're doing the ACL race bearings for the crank and main, ARP head studs, ARP rod bolts, ARP main bolts, Manley I-beam rods, CP pistons. The block we are leaving stock. It is bored 20 over, I believe. One other thing you're going to need is the Evo 10 Master gasket kit. So it comes with everything. It comes with the head gasket, valve cover gasket, this rear main seal. This is going to be a very, very long video. I'm going to cram everything into one video from how it is now to a full ready to run motor. So guys, sit back and enjoy the video. I'm going to try to give you as many tips and little tricks here and there as possible. So if you've never built a 4B11 before, or if you just want to sit back and see how a motor is assembled, enjoy the video. Let's get started. The first thing you want to do, as you can see, we have a very, very clean work area. I feel like that's one thing that a lot of people kind of skip out on when building a motor, especially at home like I do, just sitting here in my shop. So try to get a table, throw some shop towels down on the table, get everything clean. Other than that, you're gonna want shop towels. I have 2 rolls of these. You're gonna want a brake cleaner to clean all the parts before assembly. We have the 3-bond 1215 sealant right here that we're gonna be using in a few different areas on this motor. A bunch of other towels or shop rags right here we can throw away. What else? Obviously all the parts to install. So we got the cradle here, bearings, block, crank, oil pump, rods, pistons. As far as measuring stuff goes before we throw the motor together, what we need to measure is the rod bearing clearance, the main bearing clearance. On that, I will be using plastic gauge. I know that's kind of frowned upon in the community, but that is what I have to work with, so that's what we're using. I don't have all the specialty tools to properly measure everything out. So we're gonna be using plastic gauge. We need to check the piston wall clearance. We need to set the ring end gap. And I believe, other than that, we should be ready to assemble. We are going to be doing all that stuff first. So checking all the bearing clearances, piston wall clearance, and setting the ring end gap. Get all that kind of boring stuff out of the way, and then we can start assembling the motor. One more thing you guys will need, I almost forgot, is we have this Wiseco 86.5 millimeter ring compressor. This is how you get the pistons and rings down into the cylinder wall. So you put the piston in here and it slowly tapers down to 86.5 millimeter, which will allow the rings to compress all the way and get the piston with the rings down into the cylinder wall. So pick one of these up, whatever size you need. This is 86.5, stock is 86 mil. So if you're just doing like drop-ins or something, you'll need an 86 mil. You're gonna need a wide variety of tools. The only specialty tools you'll need is a torque wrench. I have this foot-pound torque wrench that goes up to 140 foot-pounds, and then the smaller inch-pound torque wrench, which goes up to 235 inch-pounds. So I'll be using these two, and other than that, it's going to be like regular tools that anyone's going to have in their shop. One thing I want to keep clear with you is the key component to building like a very long-lasting motor is making sure everything is clean. Just start with everything being clean. So I dropped this block, crank, and rods off where we are reusing my older rods, which are the I-beams, mainly I-beams. I dropped all that off at the machine shop, so the crank is polished. We got a fresh bore and hone on the block, along with the head surface being resurfaced. And then obviously the rods are all polished. Rods are good to go there. What went wrong with my old motor was a really bad detonation on cylinder 3, so it took out that piston and the block as well. So this is a new block, or a used new block. All right, let's start with checking the main bearing clearances. So I'm going to flip this around so one is on this side. We shouldn't have to do anything different here. We're just checking them to make sure the machine shop did their job right. Currently installed on here are the ARP 2000 main bolts. So we're gonna pull these off. Every single one of these caps is labeled, but when I pull them off, I'm just gonna keep them in order how they came off. So 1 through 5, pull them out. Okay, next step is I'm going to clean up all of this right here. Just give the whole block a good cleaning. Clean the bore, clean the cylinder walls, clean where the bearings are gonna sit, clean the threads with brake cleaner and a Q-tip. Just go through the whole block, make sure it's all perfect and good to go. You guys see why we have to go through the block and clean it? It's not the machinist's job to clean all the holes. Their job is to resurface the gasket area and do all that, the machining work. Look how much metal came out of these head bolt holes. That's why we clean everything up. I'm pretty confident that the block is 100% clean, so I'm gonna move on to cleaning up this crankshaft real quick. There are oil ports or gullies where every single bearing rides, so make sure you get all this cleaned out as well. Last thing I'm gonna do is clean up these crank caps. Make sure you get all the bolts cleaned up as well. Okay, so next up we are going to grab our plastic gauge. This is the green one, it's the smallest one, so it goes from 0.001 to 0.003 inches, which is perfect. Just break a little piece off and set it right on top. Now very, very gently take your crank cap and we're gonna set it over the plastic gauge, making sure the plastic gauge doesn't fall off at all. All the caps are on. Now we got to get the main bolts in. I would highly recommend throwing a bit of bolt lube on here. So it's made by Manley. I'm pretty sure it's probably made by somebody else, but it came with the Manley rods. So just throw a touch on each bolt. You don't need too much, just a little bit of bolt lube on each one. After we have the plastic gauge in here, be sure not to turn the crank at all or else it's going to mess up your readings on the plastic gauge. There is a torque sequence when torquing down these mains. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All the inners and then do the same thing with the outers. We're going to start off by torquing the inside ones to 27 foot-pounds. Now we're gonna switch over to the outer ones, and those are gonna go to 80 inch-pounds. So I'm grabbing my inch torque wrench. Make sure you follow the OEM torque sequence. Now we're gonna go back to the inner ones, the 10mm ones, and those are gonna go to 70, a final torque spec of 70 foot-pounds. And then the outer ones are gonna go to a final torque spec of 32 foot-pounds. All right, everything is torqued down. Now we can take off and loosen every single bolt in that same exact sequence and then pull the crank caps off and measure the plastic gauge based off of this little gauge that is on the plastic dip or the plastic gauge package. Now we're gonna take our little gauge right here and see what these are measuring at. So rip a little piece off. This is all on the machine shop, guys. You don't necessarily have to check this, but you might as well. You might as well double check the machine shop's work. Say if it was off, you'd have to get oversized bearings and then bring it back to the machine shop and have them machine down the crank. But we're all good to go. We need to get all the plastic gauge off of the bearings and the crank. So I'll be using a little bit of brake cleaner and some lint-free towels, get them all cleaned up. Now we're gonna have to repeat the same exact process with the rods as well. The rods that we're shooting for 0.0015 to 0.020, I believe. 0.0015 to 0.020. Same exact process. The rod bolts go to, you're supposed to measure the rod bolts with a stretch gauge, but I don't have a stretch gauge. So APR recommends torquing them down to 30 foot-pounds. Once again, utilizing this bolt lubricant. I'm gonna get this cleaned up and then we can move on to the rods. Remember, every single rod cap you pull off has to go back on that same exact rod. They are machined together. Do not mix them up. I'm gonna go throw these in the vise real quick and bust them loose because they are pretty tight. When you are installing these rods and caps together, bearing tang, the tang is the little piece of bearing that sticks into the cap, I guess is the best way to explain it. They have to match up. So tang and tang on the rod and cap together, they both match up. And then those are going to face toward me when the flywheel side is over here. It probably doesn't really matter on this motor. I know on Subarus it does. Evos, I don't think it matters, but that's how I'm gonna do it because that's how it came out. All right, so all the bearing clearances are checked. We're all good to go there. The next thing we're gonna do is check the piston to wall clearance. So we're gonna grab this little T gauge. Once again, this is not the most 100% accurate way, but it is the tools I have, so this is the tools I'm gonna use. And we're gonna put it down in there. This is measuring at 3.4045. Now on the piston, when you're measuring the piston, you wanna go 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the skirt. So we're gonna measure that at, that's right at 3.400000. That is a little bit looser than it should be. The CP spec calls for 3.5 thousandths of an inch. That is 4.5 thousandths of an inch, but 1/1000th of an inch is pretty minuscule. They're gonna feel pretty dang loose when you get them in there. These are forged pistons. So the difference between forged and cast, like piston to wall clearance wise, forged are gonna be much looser because they expand a lot more than cast pistons do. If it was a cast piston, it'd be like maybe 2/1000ths of an inch. These are 4.5 thousandths of an inch. So it's like double the clearance. I wish they were a tiny bit tighter. So there may be some very small piston slop when we go to run this thing. Like when the motor's cold, when it warms up, it'll be fine. In all honesty, it's much better to have a loose piston than it is a tight piston. If it's loose, you're gonna get some piston slop when it's cold, and that's it. If it was tight though, when it's gonna sound fine when it starts, when it's cold, but as soon as it warms up and you're building high horsepower, the piston's gonna expand when it gets super hot and seize up. So not much else we can do. I'm gonna run these pistons how they are. I can't bore this block again and get more pistons because it would be at 87 millimeter, and I'm not cool with running this Evo motor at 87 mil. 86.5 is like the max I would go. So we're gonna run these pistons. I already measured all of them. They are all at about 4.5 thousandths of an inch. So next thing to do is move on to the piston ring end gap. They have this spec sheet here, this ring end gap chart, street high performance. You are gonna need one of these piston ring end gap filers. I will link this down below if you guys wanna pick one up. You can use a file if you're really good at using a file, but I prefer just to use this ring end gap filer. They're pretty cheap. So how you get the ring end gap, you're gonna wanna open your rings. Once again, we're only doing the first and second ring. Oil rings, we're gonna leave how they are. You don't need to file those down at all. So how you get the ring end gap, you're gonna pull your rings out. The top ring is the silver ring. The second ring is the black ring. The N, the marking, goes up. So when it's on the piston, there's an N stamped on there. There might be a dot, there might be something else. It always faces up. So how you get a ring down in the cylinder wall properly, you're gonna compress it a little bit, get it down in the bore, flip it sideways, and then grab your piston, flip it upside down, and push the ring down into the cylinder wall, like so. So the top ring's currently at 0.012, and we want that to be 0.018. So we got a bit to file on it. Let's get to work, guys. So until a 0.018 feeler gauge is tight in between there, we will keep filing. And you have to make sure you're filing it square. So when you push it together and the ends meet, you gotta make sure both the top and bottom are touching at the same time. All right, ring number 1 is done, 0.018. Now we're gonna grab ring number 2, the second ring, and this is gonna go to 0.021. Honestly, it may already be at 0.021. We may be in luck. Close. So that is how you go about doing the piston ring end gaps. Whatever cylinder you gap them to, make sure you put them back in the box and label, or keep them with piston number 1 and cylinder number 1. I'm gonna go bust out the other 3, and then we can move on to actually assembling the short block. This is definitely the most time-consuming process. Once we get everything set, though, it's a breeze to get this thing together. ring end gaps are all set, good to go there. Next thing to do is start assembling. So the first thing we are going to do is clean up the block a little bit and get the crank in. This is where stuff kind of starts getting fun. I really do enjoy assembling motors. So let's get after it. Just gonna grab some brake cleaner, wipe everything down one more time. So this is where assembly lube starts coming in handy. You're gonna need assembly lube on all the bearing surfaces, the wrist pins, pretty much everything that we're throwing together except for the cylinder walls. We're not gonna be using assembly lube to put the pistons into the cylinder walls. I'll show you guys what we'll be doing there. So I like to use Redline assembly lube. It's always been really nice stuff. Simply just put your bearings in, get them seated all the way, make sure they're nice and clean before you get them installed. Now we're gonna grab a bit of assembly lube, throw it on the bearings. I'll link some of the stuff down below if you guys want to go get some for your own motor builds. I really do like the Redline products. Throw some of that on there. Now we're gonna grab our crank, wipe it down one more time, and get it installed into the block. All right, one more thing to do before we get everything together, guys, and that is to put these thrust bearings in. So these go right in the center, on the center hole, and they just slip right in just like that. And these just hold the crank from shifting side to side. You can throw a little bit of assembly lube on them to kind of hold them in place until you get the crank in. Or kind of make them stick to the block. All right, let's throw this guy together. We already have the assembly lube on those bearings and on the crank. Now we can get all the crank caps on and we'll be on our way. Make sure everything's lubed up with assembly lube. You don't want to run this thing dry at all when you're first starting it up. I'm going to throw a tiny bit more of this bolt lube on here just to make sure we get the proper torque spec. All right, 27 foot-pounds. Same as before, guys. Same exact torque spec as when we were checking the clearances, 27 foot-pounds on the inners. And now we're going to move to the outers, which go to 80 inch-pounds. Not 80 foot-pounds, guys, 80 inch-pounds. Now we're going to go back to the inners, which is the final torque of 70 foot-pounds. Back to the outers with a final torque of 32 foot-pounds, which isn't all that much compared to the inners. All right, I'm going to run through and double check everything, make sure it's all tight. After I check every single bolt, I'm going to put a mark of yellow paint on it just to make sure I hit them all. Next thing we are going to move on to is getting the pistons onto the rods and then the rods and pistons into the block. So what we're going to do first is get the pistons onto the rods. All right, let's get this block kind of out of the way. So the pistons are not marked which way they go. Valve reliefs on the piston, the intake ones are bigger, so it's going to sit in the cylinder like so. So the bigger valve reliefs are going to face toward me. And then as far as the rod goes, it probably doesn't matter, like I've said before, but bearing tangs are going to go toward the back of the motor. So bearing tangs toward the back, bigger valve reliefs toward the front. It's going to sit in there like that. Then we're going to get the rings on, drop the piston down into the block. All right, so right here we have our rod, our piston, our rings, circlips, and wrist pin. First thing we are going to do is get one circlip into the piston. All right, we got the one circlip in on the one side. Now let's pull out this wrist pin. One thing I'm gonna do right now is pull off the rod cap. They're both marked right here, as you can see, 4 and 4. So we know that goes to piston 4. Pull that guy off. All right, what we're gonna do, grab some assembly lube, lube up this bearing inside the rod. Okay, and then also lube up the wrist pin. And then we can start sliding this wrist pin through the piston. Intake valve reliefs are going to go toward the front, and the tang on the bearing is going to go toward the back. Just make sure those are opposite. Slide that all the way through, and then we can grab our other circlip, get it in the piston. All right, now it is time to move on to the piston rings. So what we're going to do, grab our piston rings, pull them out of the box. First ring that goes on is this wavy ring. It's called the oil expander ring. The end gap of the oil expander ring is going to sit either here or here. I'm going to set it right here, so right at the exhaust valve relief. Spread it apart, throw it on, just like that. Pretty easy to do. And then we have 2 of the thin oil rings. These ones here are called the oil scraper rings, and they're going to go 1 on each side, so 1 above and 1 below the oil expander ring. The bottom end gap is going to sit right there, and the top end gap is going to sit on that port. Okay, now grab our second compression ring. This end gap is going to sit right here. Make sure the end is up. The second compression ring is the black one, the iron ring. So we're going to get that on first, and then we can get the top one on. That one's good to go. Top one, same concept. The end facing toward the top of the motor. This ring end gap is going to sit right there. Alright, we are ready to install this. As you can see, we already have the other three pistons and rods in there. What we're going to do on this 4th hole is clean it up with a bit of brake cleaner. Make sure it's all nice and clean, and then grab our ring compressor. Put a little bit of WD-40 on there. We are using WD-40 to lube the cylinder walls. We don't want to use assembly lube because it's a little too thick. WD-40 allows the rings to break in nice and fast. So just grab the piston, drop it down through the compressor, get all the rings compressed, drop it into the cylinder wall. So that's where we are now. Now you can just tap it in there. Make sure the ring compressor is all the way against the block, and just tap it in. Just like that, we are done. Now we can take our block, flip it over, and we can get the rod caps on, and the girdle on, or the cradle, oil pump, and the oil pan. So you already know the first thing we're gonna do is put some assembly lube on the crank where the rod caps are gonna go, or the rods sit. All right, we can grab a bit of assembly lube, and we're gonna do cylinder 1 and cylinder 4 right now. Get the rod caps on. Make sure bearing tang on here goes to bearing tang on the rod as well. We're gonna start off by torquing these down to 44 inch-pounds, and then we're gonna go to 15 foot-pounds, and then the final torque spec of 30 foot-pounds on these ARP 2000s. All right, same thing as before. I'm gonna go double check all 8 bolts, and as I check them off, I am going to throw a little marking on them with the yellow paint pen. Okay, most likely the hardest part of the motor assembly is finished. Next up is the engine cradle. So what we're gonna do, clean off this gasket surface with some brake cleaner once again. Get it nice and clean, and then apply our 3-bond 1215 sealant to that gasket surface. All right, we got it all cleaned up. Let's set it up on the motor, and then we can grab our bolts for it and get them installed. So there are a total of 6 of those bolts, and we're gonna start with this one here. So number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and these all go to 19 foot-pounds. We're actually not torquing the bolts down yet. I'm gonna hand tighten them, and we have to let the sealant set up for about 30 minutes before we can actually torque these bolts down. So just get them snugged up with your hand, and step away and let it sit for about 30 minutes. The 30 minutes is up. Let's go ahead and torque these things down 19 foot-pounds. Follow the torque sequence Mitsubishi provided. Next up is the ARP head bolt installation, or the head studs. So we are going to be running the ARP 2000s. First thing we want to do is go through and re-clean all of the holes where the head studs go. I'm going to flip the motor over, squirt some brake cleaner in the 8 holes, blow it out with compressed air, go through it one more time, and make sure everything's good to go. Now all of these studs here just go in by hand tight. There's no torque spec on them. So I'm gonna grab my tiny impact here and just run them all the way down and just get them hand tight. Gotta make sure all those threads are clean. I went through and cleaned all the threads on the stud and in the block as well. If you notice any binding when you're putting these into the block, make sure you pull the stud out and clean up whatever the stud is hanging on. Before we throw the head on, we do have this oil control valve filter, OCV filter. It's gonna go in this hole right here. This is the timing side. I'm gonna squirt this down with brake cleaner, blow it out with compressed air, and get it installed. It is now time to clean up the gasket surface where the head goes. So you already know, brake cleaner, lint-free towel, clean it down. Before we throw the head gasket on the timing cover side over here, there's these two little tabs that stick out. We're gonna be throwing some of the 3-bond 1215 on the bottom side of the head gasket and on the top side. So right on these two little tabs, you guys will see, make sure you get some sealant on there. You don't want any leaks. All right, that's all cleaned up, ready to go. Don't forget the little bit of sealant that goes here. Now we can grab our head gasket. I am using all OEM Mitsubishi gaskets and seals on this build. So grab your gasket and throw it on the block. There's only one way the gasket can go, so don't worry about getting it on backwards. This hole here and this hole here have to go over the dowels. Now we're gonna grab a little bit more sealant and throw it on these areas again on the top side. Now we have to prepare the cylinder head. So throwing down some new paper towel here. We're gonna pull the cams off, set them on this towel with the cam caps on top, because every cam cap has to go back in the same exact location. They are numbered I1, I2, I3, I4 for intake, and then E1 through 4 for exhaust. So just in case you don't get them back on in the same place, look at the numbering and make sure. They are line bored and honed, torqued down to the head. So you got to get these back on in the same location or your cam's not gonna spin. I'm gonna go through, clean up the head with brake cleaner and some towels, and then we can get it installed. So before we put the head onto the motor, there are two washers for the ARP studs we need to install. They're the two washers that go on this timing side. So just simply grab the washers, throw them on the head. I will be using a little bit of this the fastener lube just to make sure everything gets torqued down to the proper spec. All right, head is ready to go on the motor. Make sure it seats down all the way with no gaps anywhere. All right, we are good to go. I'm gonna throw the rest of the washers on there and then get the nuts on there with the hardware lube as well. And then we can get to torquing down this head. Now on these two studs right here, on the timing cover side, you will need to use a ground down socket to get inside the head. I'm sure they sell another socket that will fit, but I just ground one down here and it works perfect. I'm gonna run through, snug all these up with like no torque at all, and then we can get to torquing down this head. All right, the torque sequence is as follows. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we're gonna do that exact sequence to 30 foot-pounds, and then repeat it to 60 foot-pounds, and then repeat it again to the final torque spec of 90 foot-pounds. Head is fully torqued. It is time to move on to the cams. So I got a bit of assembly lube on the cam journals and the cam tappets as well. There is this bearing right here for the exhaust cam that sits on the timing side. Little thrust bearing, make sure you get that in. I'm gonna clean up these cams and the cam caps and we can get them installed. There also is a thrust bearing on the top of this cam cap as well, in the same exact location that the lower one is in. I'm gonna snug all these down and then we can get to torquing them to the proper spec. Okay, the torque spec on the cam caps, we're gonna start with the smaller ones first. They go to 106 inch-pounds, and we start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 106 inch-pounds. Now we move on to this end cap here, which goes to 22 foot-pounds, and it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. From here, we can either bolt on the oil pan or flip the motor over, do the timing components, and do the timing cover first, and then the oil pan. I'm gonna go the timing cover first route because the oil pan actually bolts onto the timing cover. So it makes sense for us to do the timing cover first. So I'm gonna flip this motor over and we can get started on the timing components. The first thing we are going to do is get the two lines on the cam gears. They have to line up with the head, and they're also going to be facing each other as well. So I'm going to grab a 14mm socket and just turn the cams over until the lines are lined up with this top head right here. The next thing we need to do is get the motor at top dead center. So I'm going to grab the timing cover, set the timing cover on, and then grab the crank pulley, put the crank pulley on, and get the motor at top dead center. So how we know it's at top dead center, there's this line right here on the pulley that is going to go to the T on the timing cover. Alright, this thing is ready to be timed. Before we throw on the timing chain, we do need to get on the oil pump and the oil pump chain as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now, and then we can get on the timing chain. So there are 3 bolts holding the oil pump on. These all go to 20 foot-pounds. So on this timing chain, there are a bunch of gold links or darker colored links. I actually painted them yellow so you guys can see them easier. But this one over here is going to line up with the dot on the cam. There'll be 4 links right in the center. This one's going to run over. It'll line up with the dot on this cam. You may have to spin the cam back just a tiny bit to get it on, and then you can put it back in place. Then it's going to run all the way down, and there will be a dot on the crank gear as well that everything lines up with. So when it's all said and done, you'll have a gold link lined up with that cam, a gold link lined up with that cam, 4 gold links right in the center. These 2 lines on the cam gears are facing each other and lined up with the head, and then 1 gold link down here lined up with a dot on the crank gear. If all that looks good, we can go ahead and get on the 2 timing chain guides down here, and we also have some oil pump guides we got to get on. We can also set on the tensioner, tighten her down a little bit. And then we have to go through and make sure the timing chain did not slip at all, because it tends to slip before you pull this cotter pin out. So this is how everything should look, guys. Start off by making sure these 2 cam gears are facing each other and lined up with the head, these lines right here. And then yellow dot right there goes to the dot on the cam gear, 4 right in the center. Yellow dot goes to cam gear there. Gonna run all the way down. Yellow dot down here goes to the crank gear right there. But to make sure the motor's at top dead center, we had to throw on the timing cover. If all that looks good, grab this pin on your tensioner, pull the pin out. It'll tighten up the chain, make sure nothing slipped at all. So this here is a 2008 motor. My car's an 08, and we are doing a 2015 block on it. So the 08 to 10s have this oil squirter right here that squirts down onto the crank gear. It's for the timing chain. But in 2011, they did away with that. So guys, we are not going to be using this little oil squirter right here. The next thing to do before we put on the timing cover is to go through and torque down all of those bolts. They all go to 17 inch-pounds. We are now ready to put the timing cover onto the motor. So I'm gonna go through, wipe down all the gasket surfaces on the timing cover and on the motor with some brake cleaner, get it all dried up. And we will be applying the 3-bond 1215 to this timing cover. So we will be applying the 3-bond to this whole gasket surface here, and this, and that area as well. So don't miss those 3 sections right in the center. So we're just gonna get all of these bolts on here hand tight. This one right in the center, guys, that goes here, it has the crush washer on it, so don't forget that little washer. You may have a little oil leak there if you do. So just snug them up. As that is drying, we can get the valve cover prepped and the new seal on the valve cover, and get the valve cover on the motor as well. I'm just gonna grab the seal, get the seal on the valve cover. Before we get the valve cover on, we're gonna put a dab of sealant where the timing cover meets the head. So right here and right here. And we do also need to throw on this little guide as well. It's gonna sit just like this. And this goes to 17 inch-pounds. All right, valve cover is ready to go on. Make sure you do get that seal on where the time chain cover meets the head. Definitely gonna need that. I'm just gonna snug all these down. There is a torque sequence for the valve cover as well, but for now I'm gonna snug them down and then I'll run through and torque them down to the proper torque spec with the sequence. So the bolts go to 27 inch-pounds and then we're gonna retorque them down to 49 inch-pounds. While we are still up here, I'm going to swap out these spark plugs for a new set and then get the coil packs on as well. And then we can flip the motor over, throw the oil pan on, and then wait for the sealant on the timing cover to dry and the oil pan to dry, and then we can torque everything down and we will be done with this motor build. The plugs we are using on this motor are NGK ILKR8E6, and they're gapped. They come pre-gapped already, but I double checked the gap and they're all at 0.020, and that's exactly what they should be. Alright guys, it is time to throw on the oil pan. Pretty much the very last thing to do on this motor build. So what I'm going to do, clean up the gasket surface on here and the oil pan as well. Apply the sealant to the oil pan, and then we get the pan on the motor and get all the bolts in, get it torqued down on the proper torque sequence. Actually, I don't know if there's a torque sequence on the pan, but yeah. This is pretty much it. Let's get her done. So all these smaller ones, the ones with a 10mm head, go to 89 inch-pounds. And then the bigger ones with the 12mm head go to 22 foot-pounds. All right, my friends, that is a wrap. That is a full Mitsubishi Evo 10 4B11T long block build from absolutely nothing to a complete ready-to-run motor. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure you go down below, smash that thumbs up button. If you have any questions whatsoever, drop a comment in the comment section below. I'll try to link everything I used on this build down in the description box. So the sealant I used, the rods, pistons, I'll link the gasket kit, the timing chain, everything I used on this motor, I'll try to link it down in the description box below for you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. I know it was a super long video, definitely the longest video on my channel. If you made it to the end, mad props to you guys, because I know this video is definitely going to be over an hour long. Thank you so much for watching. This motor should be in the car soon, so stay tuned for that video, and hopefully this thing runs like it should. Peace out, guys. Thank you for watching once again. I'll see you in the next video when we get this thing in.